On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court did something that few analysts predicted with this speed or force. In a 6-3 ruling, it struck down the most powerful economic weapon Donald Trump had built in his second term, his emergency tariffs. It was not paused. It was not scaled back. The court declared it unconstitutional from the moment it was first put into place. The ruling landed at 10 in the morning. By noon, Trump was at a White House podium calling his own appointed justices a disgrace to their families. He said the decision was an embarrassment, written by justices who were, and this is a direct quote from the president, not smart people. Now here's the number that anchors everything else in this story before we go anywhere else: $200 billion collected. That is the estimated total in tariff revenue taken in since Trump used IEEPA, with the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to construct his global tariff system. The Supreme Court ruled on February 20th that he never had the legal authority to impose a single dollar of it in the first place. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, was precise and deliberate. The law contains no reference to tariffs or duties at all. He added a line that will be cited in trade law courses for years. Until now, no president had read that statute to confer such power. What that means in concrete terms: every dollar collected under those IEEPA tariffs is now a legally contested sum sitting in government accounts. Companies are already organizing to reclaim it. The Liberty Justice Center announced a centralized database to help small businesses file refund claims against the Treasury. If even a meaningful fraction of that $200 billion gets litigated back, the budget math of the entire Trump domestic agenda starts cracking under the pressure. But here is the part of this story that almost no major outlet is connecting clearly as of today, February 22nd, 2026. This ruling did not land in a quiet week. It dropped on the same day 2 American carrier strike groups were converging on the Persian Gulf with Iran in the crosshairs. It dropped the same week Trump was building the diplomatic architecture for a Beijing summit with Xi Jinping, a summit where tariffs were meant to be his primary leverage. And it dropped as China was quietly tightening rare earth export controls. Materials inside the F-35, the Tomahawk missile, and nearly every advanced system the Pentagon deploys. What this suggests is that February 20th was not simply a legal event. It was the day 3 live geopolitical pressure points collided at exactly the same moment in time. And the weapon Trump had been running across all 3 fronts at once, the tariff, broke in his hand when he needed it at full strength the most. To understand why that loss matters beyond the daily headlines, you need to understand what this instrument actually was at its operational core. Trump's IEEPA tariffs were not traditional trade policy. They were a geopolitical weapon, designed specifically for unilateral speed and direct presidential control. They required no congressional vote, no treaty ratification, no public comment period. A national emergency declaration was enough to trigger them in under 48 hours. That speed was the entire strategic point. When you can move faster than the legislative process, you keep your adversary continuously off balance and unable to plan. The tariffs struck China at rates ranging from 30 to 245% across different product categories, depending on where the escalation cycle stood at any given moment. They hit Canada and Mexico on a fentanyl trafficking justification that strained diplomatic credibility even with Washington's 2 closest neighbors and largest trade partners. They hit nearly every country on Earth, with a 10% baseline the White House called reciprocal, a term that obscured what was, fundamentally, a unilateral economic pressure act. The legal logic holding all of it together was direct. Emergency powers allow the president to regulate commerce, and regulating commerce includes the power to tax imports. Roberts cut through that logic in a single line. The words regulate and importation, he wrote for the majority, cannot bear such constitutional weight as Trump claimed. The 3 dissenters, Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh, argued the majority was substituting its own policy preferences for constitutional authority assigned to the executive branch. 6 justices examined what IEEPA actually said and reached one conclusion together. The word tariff does not appear in it, and that absence is not a legal technicality. Trump's response came within hours. He announced a replacement tariff of 10% under the Trade Act of 1974, a different statute with a narrower grant of authority. By Saturday, he had revised that number upward to 15%. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told reporters the revenue impact would be, quote, virtually unchanged in 2026. What Bessent did not address is the central issue. The unilateral speed and shock capacity that made IEEPA tariffs effective simply cannot be replicated under the 1974 law. The 1974 Trade Act requires additional procedural steps, longer implementation timelines, and creates a much cleaner legal target whenever any major importer decides to challenge it. In my view, that is the real strategic loss inside this ruling. Not the tariff rate itself, but the permanent retirement of the instrument's speed and unpredictability. When opponents know you need multiple legal steps to escalate, they can plan around those steps in advance and blunt the effect before it lands. When they feared you could move in 48 hours without warning, that fear itself was leverage worth more than any specific tariff rate on any specific product. The Supreme Court just retired that fear from active service. And the question now becomes what that retirement means across 3 pressure points already in motion. Iran, China, and a domestic budget problem that was already under stress before a potential $200 billion refund obligation entered the legal picture. We are going to examine all 3 in detail, and the connections between them are significantly tighter than most of the coverage being produced right now is showing. If you have never considered how a Supreme Court tariff ruling connects to a potential military strike on Iran, stay with me. The threat is real and runs through the same 24 hours. Drop a comment. What do you think breaks first? The Iran talks, the China summit, or the tariff refund battle? Hit like. It tells me to keep going deeper. Because in part 2, we go straight to Iran and how this ruling may have quietly shifted the calculation inside the Situation Room on the exact day it was issued. On February 17, 2026, diplomats from the United States and Iran sat in separate rooms in Geneva, speaking through Omani intermediaries. They never faced each other directly. The Americans in one room, the Iranians in another, with Oman's envoys carrying proposals between them like messengers. This is not a small procedural detail. It tells you something precise about where these 2 countries actually stand in relation to each other right now. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner led the American side. Iran sent Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, its most senior active diplomatic voice on this file. After the session ended, Araghchi told Iranian state television they had reached a general understanding on what he called guiding principles for a deal. He was careful to add that reaching a final agreement quickly was not something anyone should expect. The path had begun, he said, and nothing more than that. A senior U.S. official told Axios that progress was made, while noting there are still a lot of details to discuss. Iran promised written proposals within 2 weeks. The Omani mediator described the atmosphere as constructive and said both sides had left the session with clear next steps before any 3rd round of talks. That is the diplomatic surface of this story. It reads like momentum. It sounds like 2 parties slowly locating their shared ground. Now here is what was happening at the exact same time those diplomats were meeting in Geneva. On the same calendar day, February 17, 2026, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps launched live-fire exercises across the Strait of Hormuz, officially titled Smart Control of the Strait of Hormuz. During those drills, Iran temporarily closed portions of the strait to civilian navigation, a move maritime analysts described as rare in its modern history. Anti-ship cruise missiles were fired at designated targets. Drone units launched from Iran's 3 strategic islands, sitting directly inside the strait's navigable corridor. And Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei delivered a statement on the same morning the Geneva talks opened, addressed toward the American carrier groups in the Gulf. A warship is certainly a dangerous weapon, Khamenei said, but even more dangerous is the weapon capable of sinking it. No further specification was offered. That dual move, negotiated in Geneva while demonstrating military capability in the strait simultaneously, is the core of Iran's current strategic posture. Talk and flex in parallel. Every active round of diplomacy raises the political cost of military action that immediately follows a session described as constructive. Washington's response was equally dual-track. National security officials gathered in the White House Situation Room on February 18th to review strike options on Iran. Pentagon officials confirmed to NBC News that same week that all military assets required for a potential operation would be fully in place by mid-March at the latest. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced carrier ever built, was crossing the Atlantic toward the Mediterranean, escorted by its complete strike group. The USS Abraham Lincoln was already parked roughly 700 kilometers from the Iranian coast, carrying nearly 80 aircraft, including F-35C and F-18 Super Hornets on deck. More than 50 advanced jets, F-22 Raptors, F-35Cs, and F-16s, relocated to regional bases inside a single 24-hour window, confirmed by open-source flight tracking data. THAAD and Patriot missile defense systems were repositioned. Submarines entered the theater. Refueling tankers moved into position for extended multi-day air operations. On February 19th, Trump told reporters on Air Force One that they would get a deal, or it would be unfortunate for Iran. 10 to 15 days was his stated maximum window. On February 20th, asked whether he was considering a limited military strike, Trump responded, "I guess I can say I am considering that." The words were selected carefully. Military assessments delivered to the White House, per CNN and CBS sources, indicated the force was physically ready for action as early as the weekend of February 21st. No final decision had been made, but the infrastructure of a decision was assembled, and the clock Trump had set publicly was now running without a visible off switch. Now here is where the Supreme Court ruling from February 20th enters the Iran equation. And the connection requires attention because it is real and largely underreported. The IEEPA tariff was Trump's fastest non-military pressure lever on Iran's primary economic lifeline. That lifeline runs almost entirely through a single country, China. China absorbs roughly 90% of all Iranian oil exports, per Atlantic Council data. Reduce Beijing's appetite for that oil, and Tehran's main revenue stream begins to collapse. Under IEEPA, Washington could escalate tariffs on China within 48 hours, in direct response to continued Iranian oil purchases during an active nuclear standoff. That threat no longer moves at the same speed. The 1974 Trade Act requires procedural steps that extend the response window from days into weeks, or longer under legal challenge. The second dimension of this connection is harder to see, but arguably more consequential for how decisions get made at the presidential level in real time. On February 21st, Fawaz Gerges, a professor of international relations at LSE, told CNN something that deserves serious consideration as an analytical variable in this story. He noted that, historically, American presidents tend to divert domestic attention by taking action overseas, and that the court ruling could now accelerate Trump's Iran timeline. That observation came from a credentialed academic on live television, reflecting a pattern seen across multiple American administrations in moments of domestic political difficulty. In my view, this should be held as a real variable, not a certainty, but a pressure that adds measurable weight to a decision already being made under visible time constraints. A president who just lost a major constitutional ruling, who called his appointees a disgrace, is weighing the one decision that immediately reshapes the national conversation. That political context does not determine what happens inside the Situation Room. Military planners work from threat assessments and operational readiness, not domestic polling numbers, but it adds real pressure to an environment already running under a publicly stated deadline, with a diplomatic track that has not yet closed the core gap between the two sides. Because that gap is the actual problem. And the language produced in Geneva was crafted carefully enough to obscure just how wide the gap remains beneath the diplomatic surface. Washington's demand is zero enrichment on Iranian soil, a permanent structural end to the program. Iran's counter is a 3 to 5 year suspension, with nothing permanently dismantled. Those positions do not meet in the middle. A suspension that expires after Trump leaves office is not what the administration means when it uses the word deal in public statements. Iran's nuclear infrastructure was meaningfully degraded by Israeli and American strikes in June 2025. The crisis group noted, Iran has not operated a single centrifuge since that war. That degradation makes Iran's negotiating posture harder to soften. Having paid the physical cost already, Tehran has less reason to formalize a concession it already absorbed. What Iran needs from any agreement is sanctions relief, economic oxygen, that the current isolation levels are visibly denying both the Iranian population and the government itself. What Washington demands is dismantlement of enrichment, ballistic missile limits, and curtailed proxy support. 3 demands Tehran has publicly declared entirely off the table. Most analysts describe these talks not as a real negotiation toward a deal, but as a mechanism both sides use to manage the clock and shift the cost of the next escalation step. In my view, that is the most accurate frame for Geneva, a holding pattern, preserving enough ambiguity to delay a decision that neither side has fully resolved internally. And here's what that means precisely as of today, February 22nd, 2026, the day this video was published, and these pressures were all simultaneously active at once. Iran's written proposals arrive within 2 weeks. When they land, the gap between zero enrichment and a 3 to 5 year pause will no longer hide behind language like guiding principles. The carriers will remain in position. The jets will stay on regional runways. The Situation Room will run the same calculation it started on February 18th, without a pause. And the fastest economic lever Washington had to tighten pressure on Iran's only significant buyer, the IEEPA tariff, will no longer move at the speed the next 2 weeks may require. That is the Iran dimension of the February 20th collision. Converging pressures on the same short window with meaningfully reduced flexibility on the American side of the table. In part 3, we go to Beijing, the summit Trump was building toward in April, and how the court ruling may have changed what Xi Jinping believes he is walking into. On the same Friday, the Supreme Court struck down Trump's tariffs. The White House confirmed a second event that almost no outlet directly connected to the first. Trump would travel to Beijing on March 31st for a 3-day summit with Xi Jinping, his first visit to China since returning to power in January 2025. The timing, same day, same news cycle as the ruling, was either a remarkable coincidence or a calculated attempt to shift the national conversation. Either way, it created a situation with no clean precedent. A president confirming a foreign summit the same morning his primary negotiating weapon was ruled unconstitutional. Xi Jinping, a professor of international relations at Renmin University in Beijing, told the South China Morning Post what that moment looked like from across the Pacific. He assessed that the ruling weakened Trump's trade leverage with the Chinese side, while adding that this did not automatically translate into a strategic gain for Beijing. That second clause matters. A weakened Trump does not mean a stronger Xi at the summit table, but it changes the architecture of what each side is actually walking into. In October 2025, Trump and Xi met in Busan, South Korea. Both sides called the result a trade truce, a pause on escalating tariffs, and pullback on some export controls. China agreed to resume soybean purchases and temporarily ease rare earth restrictions. The U.S. agreed to roll back several rounds of tariff increases on Chinese goods. Melanie Hart at the Atlantic Council noted Beijing has been using pre-scheduled 2026 summits to box Trump in and neutralize his unpredictability as a negotiating tool. By announcing 3 Xi meetings on social media, Trump surrendered a key bargaining chip, the prospect of withholding presidential engagement as leverage before talks begin. Now add what China has been doing with rare earth exports, the weapon that links the court ruling, the Beijing summit, and the military situation in the Gulf simultaneously. Rare earths are 17 metallic elements structural to the most advanced military technology the United States produces, from fighter jets to submarines to missile guidance systems. The Defense Department's numbers are specific. Each F-35 contains roughly 900 pounds of rare earth materials. A single submarine can require more than 9,000 pounds to build. China controls 61% of global rare earth mining and 92% of global processing, a processing monopoly that takes a decade or more to meaningfully displace. Beginning in April 2025, Beijing imposed export licensing on 7 heavy rare earth elements used directly in defense: terbium, dysprosium, samarium, and 4 additional elements. By mid-2025, only roughly 25% of license applications had been approved by Chinese regulators, per a supply chain assessment published in the fall of that year. The Busan Truce included Beijing's agreement to ease these restrictions for 1 year. That concession expires in November 2026, conveniently after the Beijing summit concludes. The timeline is precise. China paused the rare earth pressure exactly long enough to secure the summit it wanted, then set the expiration date as a future negotiating card. Scott Kennedy at CSIS put it plainly. China had already turned the tables by using rare earth restrictions to force reduced tariffs and limit U.S. export controls on Chinese firms. Now add the February 20th ruling on top of that pre-existing situation, and you get the precise shift that Xi Jinping was identifying from Beijing that same afternoon. Under IEEPA, Trump could have arrived at the summit carrying the credible threat of 48-hour tariff escalation if Xi delivered too little at the April negotiating table. That threat required no congressional approval, no public notice. It could be activated in real time during the summit itself, if the conversation stalled or Xi withheld. Under the 1974 Trade Act, the same threat requires procedural steps and faces immediate legal challenge from American companies with stakes in the Chinese trade relationship. The speed is gone. The unpredictability is gone. Beijing can now model exactly how long Washington needs to escalate and plan its response around that known fixed timeline. In my view, Xi is not simply hosting a weakened Trump. He is hosting a Trump whose fastest economic instrument was ruled unconstitutional 5 weeks before the summit begins. Xi took a calculated risk before Busan, rolling out rare earth controls weeks before the South Korea meeting, betting Trump would not walk away. That bet was correct. What China wants from April is straightforward: stability long enough to execute China's 15th five-year plan, a plan designed to expand its share of global manufacturing further. What Xi will offer in exchange is predictable: soybean purchases, fentanyl signals, another rare earth pause timed to expire conveniently. Headlines. Trump can frame as wins. Foreign Affairs called this a game of whack-a-mole. Washington securing headline results while Beijing stays focused on the long-term structural competition underneath. In my view, the court ruling did not create this asymmetry. It deepened one that already existed, at the worst possible moment in the pre-summit preparation window. Now pull all 3 pressure points together. On February 20th, 2026, 3 things happened that rarely converge in a single 24-hour window with this degree of consequence. The Supreme Court removed the fastest economic weapon from the president's hand, ruling it unconstitutional not just going forward, but from the moment it was first imposed. The White House confirmed a Beijing summit where that weapon was meant to be primary leverage at the table with Xi Jinping, a meeting now 5 weeks away. And 2 carriers continued toward the Persian Gulf, where the tariff had also served as indirect pressure on Iran through its primary economic relationship with China. None of these events caused the others, but they landed together, and the combined effect is a narrowing of American flexibility across all 3 fronts simultaneously. What the story is about is what happens when the main instrument of a pressure strategy breaks while all 3 fronts are simultaneously active and the clock is running. The tariff was simultaneously an economic tool, a diplomatic signal, and a military-adjacent lever, all running through the same legal authority on three fronts at once. The Supreme Court found that authority was never there. In finding that, it changed the weight of every active calculation in the system, not just the legal one. Iran reads this ruling. China reads this ruling. Every counterpart watching Washington now has access to the same text, the same timeline, and the same arithmetic. In my view, the key insight here is about interconnection. A domestic legal ruling about an economic statute echoes through a military standoff and a diplomatic summit at once. That connectivity, legal, economic, military, and diplomatic pressure all flowing through the same instrument simultaneously, is what makes February 20th a date worth understanding. And, as of today, every player in the system is recalibrating around the same new reality at the same time, with no playbook written for this precise configuration of pressures. If this changed how you see what is unfolding right now, drop a comment. Tell me which front you think breaks first and why. I rate every single one, and if you made it this far, you already know what this channel is built on. Subscribe, because the system keeps moving, and so do we.